Welcome to On Becoming a Healer. I'm Saul Wiener. In August and September of 2023, we ran a couple of episodes on the topic of time-limited testing. Both the MCATs and the USMLE exams are examples of time-limited tests, meaning that some students will feel pressure to rush through questions in order to complete the test on time or simply won't be able to complete it on time. In the first episode, the one that we're going to rerun today, we brought on a distinguished and highly qualified scholar who has written extensively about the limitations and fallacies of time-limited tests, including their impact on validity and equity. In simple terms, what we've known for many decades is that when you create time limits that put students under pressure, all you do is make it more difficult, if not impossible, for them to show what they know, meaning that you decrease the validity of the test. You decrease its ability to assess what it is designed to assess for a subset of students. This has created an entire industry of neuropsychological testing as students try to meet the requirements for demonstrating that they have a disability so that they can apply for extra time on these exams. It causes great delay in their testing. It is expensive. Some can't afford it. And many are turned down and then have to reapply for accommodations, which they may or may not get. The consequences can be, in some cases, devastating for their careers. And the question, of course, is why? Why put students through all this? Why have time limits in the first place? Why not just give any student the time they need to show what they know? The reason we're rerunning this episode now is that following the two episodes that we aired in 2023, we brought together the two guests, both highly qualified to talk about this topic, plus a third person who is a distinguished psychometrician with impeccable credentials, and myself, to write a paper that was published in this month's issue of the journal Medical Education. And the paper is titled, "The Myth That Slow Test Takers Are Worse Students: Implications for Time-Limited Testing." It's an open access article, and we're going to provide a link to it with this episode. We think this is an incredibly important topic for several reasons. First of all, if we believe that evidence should guide the way we teach and assess our learners, we need to confront the myth that if you know your stuff, you shouldn't need extra time, unless perhaps you have a disability. Someday, hopefully sooner rather than later, people will look back and wonder why in the world we created this artificial time pressure for our students and why we made it such hell for our learners to seek and obtain accommodations, when the solution, which is just to get rid of these time limits for everyone, was so obvious and so overwhelmingly supported by the evidence. Secondly, this is a matter of equity as well. The students who don't get accommodations but need them include individuals who can't afford to go through the long and costly process of seeking accommodations, or who simply wouldn't qualify, for instance, because perhaps English is a second language, or perhaps they don't meet the criteria for a qualifying disability. Maybe they just have test anxiety, or perhaps they come from a family or culture that stigmatizes disability, so they're unwilling or uncomfortable to consider the fact that maybe they do have a disability. The point is, it really shouldn't matter. If we just got rid of this obsession with time-limited testing. And then, of course, there's the issue of people resenting the fact that some students, because of their privilege, are able to get these accommodations and are thought to have done so unfairly. The point is, all of this could simply go away if we just got rid of time limits. There are actually some pretty easy ways to do it, which we discuss in our paper and that are touched on in this episode. It's time for the USMLE and the MCAT and other high-stakes exams with time limits to simply follow the evidence and to commit to greater validity and equity and do away with time limits. Thank you for listening.
Hi, and welcome to On Becoming a Healer. I'm Stefan Kertes, here with Saul Wiener. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
And we are here with a distinguished guest who we will introduce in just a moment. Today we're talking about high-stakes tests that have a time limit. High-stakes tests with time limits are a big part of getting into any profession, including medicine. Many of us have been through them. The question is whether to have time limits on these tests at all. And that's what we're going to be exploring. Saul, why are we looking at time limits on tests?
So, Stefan, as you know, and some of our listeners know, I talked about this actually on a recent episode. I have a learning disability, and so time limits were kind of a major source of anxiety and challenge for me, starting at a very early age, and it became a much bigger issue as I approached wanting to be a doctor and going through that process. It's sort of interesting because I was actually in the first round of students who was eligible for extra time in, I think it was 1991, shortly after the ADA was passed, and I don't know if I might have been the first person. I was actually very privileged. I came from a family that was well educated, and I had a paper trail going back to second grade, and the NBME approved me for that. So this has been something on my mind for years, but it's also something I've been thinking about as a faculty member, currently on the promotions committee at my medical school, where we constantly see students who are struggling with the NBME exams, in particular USMLE Step 1, where they are trying to get extra time, and often they hit a wall. They get denied that. And so we're actually going to be having two episodes on related topics. The one today, which I'm really looking forward to, and then we have another one coming up that's going to focus more specifically on the USMLE exam. It's interesting, Stefan. I'm not sure you'll identify with this because one of the things that I know about you is you don't have trouble taking these tests.
No, I don't.
Yeah. And it's something I kind of envied. I mean, you and I have known each other a long time. It's something I've envied watching. And so so I appreciate you're kind of taking the lead here in terms of hosting this, even though I know it's not something that you've had to deal with.
Yeah, and I've always felt like I almost got a little bit of extra credit when I took multiple choice tests with time limits, almost as if I knew the same amount as somebody else. I also felt like I'd probably do a little better than them because I can sort of figure out what's going on in those tests. But let's turn to our distinguished guest. Dr. Morton Ann Gernsbacher is the Vilas Research Professor and the Sir Frederick C. Bartlett Professor of Psychology in the Department of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she runs a lab that focuses on cognitive neuroscience with a focus on human communication and attention. Hi, Dr. Gernsbacher. Can I call you Morton?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for coming on today. We reached out to you because of a paper you published in 2020 with two colleagues titled 4 Empirically Based Reasons Not to Administer Time-Limited Tests. And in this paper, you argue that time-limited tests are less valid, less reliable, less inclusive, and less equitable. And we are going to go through those one by one. But one thing I want to say up front is one of the shocking things in reading this paper is how unradical the idea becomes when it looks like evidence for these propositions has been around for about 100 years. So that's why we're so excited to talk to you. How did you get into this subject, Morton?
Sure, thanks. And I'm excited to be here as well. Well, I will say that I was a good student in K through 12 and in college and in graduate school, but I never liked time-limited tests. They seemed to always put a little extra stress on me. And then when I began teaching I've actually had a first career teaching at the high school level, but when I began teaching at the college level, teaching introductory psychology with, as you know, many med students take, I really started scratching my head thinking, why am I doing to my students something that I really disliked doing myself? And so I learned how to teach down the pike. It took a few years to learn how to teach without having to administer time-limited tests. And so I haven't taught with time-limited tests for at least 15 or 20 years. But I have noticed that many of my colleagues still do. And in addition, along the way in my career, I also got very interested in disability and disability rights and disability advocacy and disability access, inclusion, and equity. And so background experiences coalesced for me to think about, let's get that literature out there. As you mentioned, some of the literature is over 100 years old, but a lot of people don't consult it. And that's what motivated.
So you've given up on time limits. Before we touch on your specific propositions, if we went back to, I don't know, the 1880s, do we know if there were time limits on tests in colleges or high schools at that time, or maybe we don't know?
That's an interesting question. Some people speculate that the time limits arose perhaps not so much in college testing, but in other ability testing, things that are often called, IQ tests or intelligence tests or abilities tests. Much of the initial ability testing arose from wanting to measure recruits to our military services. And so you have 150 recruits in one room, and it's just much more convenient to have a start time and a stop time. And that it arose from that policy or that procedure. And my sense is that that's also pretty similar to what's happening on college campuses, is that you have a start time and a stop time. And so that the time limits are often more for administrative benefit than they are as a good assay of what it is that you're assessing.
So now we need to tangle a little bit with whether they are, quote, a good assay or a bad assay for the thing we want to test. And you make the proposition direct in your paper. Time-limited tests are less valid. Less valid, I guess, at what? Less valid at what?
Well, in the test assessment literature and test evaluation literature, we tend to think of two characteristics. One is validity, which is simply, does the test measure what it's intended to measure? And, there are things like face validity. You could look at the items and say, wow, this is a driving test, but you're asking about models of cars and license plate numbers. That might not be so valid. So validity is, does the test measure what you are intending to measure? And the other that we'll get to in a moment is reliability. But turning back to validity, the notion of, does it measure what you're intending to measure? And my sense, at least at the university level, is that most instructors want to measure how well students have mastered the material. And they want to measure how well students can use the material. They want to measure how well students can create or design or whatever using that material. And what we know, again, going back to the early 1900s, is that the speed with which most students take exams is not related to their performance. And I often challenge my colleagues by telling them, the next time they're giving an exam, let's say with a large class of 150 students, mark down when the student turns in their exam, and then go back and do a correlation to see whether how long a student took before they turned in the exam and their performance on that exam is correlated. And there have been, as you saw in my paper, multiple studies with many different types of content material ranging all across the standard college curriculum. And they have shown pretty consistently that the speed with which students take their exams is not correlated with how well they perform on the exam. And so speed and performance is uncoupled or uncorrelated. Therefore, if one is compressing the time, you're adding in additional variance that could, in some ways, contribute to a lower validity of the exam.
I want to hear from Saul on this one.
Morton, this is music to my ears, I have to say, because when I was in school, I always was forlornly watching everybody leave the room in the auditorium where a test was being taken. And eventually there would just be, 4 or 5 of us left. And eventually it was usually just me and 1 or 2 others. I just felt like I'm the idiot. I would say these guys who are leaving really soon, really quickly, who are marching out, they're so darn smart. The test was so easy for them. They probably got everything right, and that's why they're leaving. And, me, I'm struggling here, trying to figure out what's going on. I wish I was as smart as they were. And I think what you're telling me is that that's not necessarily the case. I may have still done better than them. In fact, there's no correlation. There's no evidence that because they marched out, half an hour before I did, that they did better than me. And that's such a revelation.
Saul, I don't think you're alone in holding that opinion or that assumption. As I said, I think that many of my colleagues hold that assumption. I talk about it in the paper as being the assumption that the best students take tests the fastest. And one can just look at your own data in your classroom and find out. And then one can also look in terms of high stakes testing. One can also look at least some of the data that have been made publicly available with regard to the duration of the test. And not so much for the MCAT, those data have not been as made publicly available, but I know for the SAT and the ACT that the same is true, that the students' duration of taking the test is not related to their performance on the test. And so back to Stefan's question with regard to validity, if that is an additional variable, if that speed is an additional variable that's not correlated with performance, then when we compress the time for a test, we're adding in additional variation, and that's what reduces the validity of the test.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. You talked a little bit about the origin of the term mental retardation, which is now a widely recognized pejorative term. But certainly when I was younger, we would say, oh, this person is mentally retarded. And it was so fascinating to me to learn that concept, it's not only pejorative, but it's wrong. And you said the original definition in Merriam-Webster was, quote, an abnormal slowness of thought or action. And just this whole notion that is so deeply embedded in our culture that if you're slow at something, you can't be so bright. And it's just so fascinating how deeply ingrained that has become, even among educators.
Exactly. And so again, it's an assumption that slow is not smart and that fast is smart.
So I want to try something out here, which is that here, as you've set it up, there's two things that are separate. One is kind of understanding and intelligence or capacity to deal with a given subject versus speed of responding. And these are two things sitting in two different buckets. And when we impose a time limit, my guess is we impose an anxiety burden for a significant number of people. Is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. I think it's also just, again, to uncouple those two issues, that it's not really even just in test taking. In my paper, I talk about pilots, that pilots' speed of responding is unrelated to their skill at piloting. Teachers' speed at assembling new material for their courses is not necessarily related to how well or how beneficial their materials can be. And there are multiple other domains in which that's the case.
I want to offer an example of a situation where potentially anxiety and pressure are part of the job, and therefore one might make the argument that we want to test you under anxiety-provoking conditions. So a lot of our audience is people in medical training or medical education, and they may say, look, medicine is a high-stress job. People are called upon to make instantaneous decisions that might have life or death implications. And so, frankly, we're not really just interested in whether you've mastered anything. We want to know whether your mastery shows under conditions of anxiety and time limitations. If that is what they care about, is that then an argument for time-limited tests in medical education in particular?
Well, I'll back up again to talk about those pilots. When I board a plane, I want to know that my airline pilot is competent. And one could say, I want to make sure that that airline pilot can operate rapidly under stressful conditions. But I also really want to make sure that that airline pilot can operate accurately under those stress conditions. Let me also just segue to say that undoubtedly there are tasks and challenges. Typing, for example. Typing is a good example where you do want someone who's both accurate and speedy. That you could be incredibly accurate, but only typing 20 words per minute, and you might not be hired as someone who's going to be a court reporter or a stenographer. And then conversely, you could be incredibly fast, but make a lot of errors. So there are tasks, individual tasks, in which getting to that really high sweet spot of high accuracy under very high pressure time conditions is important. But I think in terms of our career development, we need to think about, is that the modal case or is that only the occasional case that you are going to be under that super high pressure for time? And if it's just the occasional case, then I think we need to take a step back and think about, well, then why are we creating those scenarios for our trainees?
Saul, from a medical education perspective, what do you think of the argument that we really want to pick as our future doctors or our future residents those who make decisions under highly anxiety-provoking, time-limited conditions the best?
Well, I think one thing that's well known is that multiple choice test taking does accurately predict one thing, which is multiple choice test taking. So if somebody can take a test quickly under time pressure and do well, they will probably show that same behavior repeatedly on future multiple choice tests and vice versa. But the question is to what extent does that predict how they'll do in the operating room when dealing with a complex patient under surgical conditions that require fast decision making and stress? And I guess what I would argue is it's conceivable there's a relationship, but there's such profoundly different situations that I would say the burden of proof is really on somebody who wants to try to make that case because it seems so improbable when you stop to think about it. And one thing that I thought was fascinating when Morton in her paper talked about the history of time testing is it was never even developed for that purpose. That actually the reason time testing was developed was that it was developed really for measuring very straightforward things that are kind of clerical, where if you didn't have time testing, everybody would get 100%. So you needed to create some sort of time pressure so that everyone didn't get 100% for, like, as you said, typing, for instance. But it was never actually intended to be part of the validation of something. And somehow it morphed into that. But I don't think anyone said, oh, let's make multiple choice tests really time pressured so we can tell if somebody is good in the operating room under pressure. And it's somewhat of a stretch of the imagination to think the two would be correlated. Now, obviously, unscientifically, speaking as an N of one myself, I have not had that experience. I do need double time on time testing. I've never really found that, I'm struggling to figure out what to do in the ICU or whatever. They're just so different. I mean, when you're in a real life situation, you're dealing with all kinds of complexities that draw on different skills and so forth. So, but I want to just go back to this point and have perhaps Morton comment on it, that it was never really even intended to be a valid measure of how somebody would do at something else.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Morton?
Saul is absolutely right and in fact, to this day, the best measures of ability, general ability, one of the tests that I talk about in my paper is the differential ability scale, which is a very widely used abilities measure, does not have timed components except for the more clerical component of it. And I've published research on a measure that's called the Raven's progressive matrices. And if you follow the IQ literature, that is considered really one of the purest measures of general intelligence. And I'm using air quotes here, so I don't want your listeners to think that I'm buying completely into those assumptions. But nonetheless, the Raven's progressive matrices, and it does not have any time limits. And in fact, the way that it is arranged is that the easiest items come first and the harder items come later. And the assumption is that the test person who's taking the test will stop at some point, not because they run out of time, but because the items have gotten more difficult and they can't complete them for that reason. And those measures are considered the best. We call them, and I talk about this in my paper, power tests, which is to measure someone's power, meaning their knowledge, their aptitude, their skills, rather than their speed. And most speeded tests, as you mentioned too, Stefan, are like typing tests, or I was reading in preparation for our podcast today about the motor control, because you might think, okay, well, what about motor control? Doesn't speed really help you there? And it also is a domain in which it's only to a limited extent. So in ballistic throwing, yes, speed's going to help you. But in terms of making judgment and decision making and assessing the situation, a bit like what Saul is talking about in the operating room or in the intensive care unit, speed does not help you that much. There was a paper that came out just a few months ago that used both human data and some simulations. And its upshot was that the easier the item, the more speed might matter, because it's a lot like typing tests or the like. But the more complex the item on the test, the more speed just doesn't matter. And I think that what you were describing, Stefan, in terms of complex medical situations, those are complex. I'll just mention one more thing, since we are still talking about validity, which is the most valid test of how well a medical student in training is going to do in a complex medical situation is to put them in that complex medical situation. That's what we mean by validity, and that these tests are just approximating that.
I think that helps clarify that time limit introduces an additional thing that may distort from the measurement of what we care about. And I think that's helpful. I'd like to turn to the second proposition in your paper, which we may give slightly less attention as it seems potentially wonky. But anyone who develops surveys, tests, or measurements does think about reliability of that measurement. And you do mention that time-limited tests are less reliable. What is reliability for these purposes?
So reliability is just kind of like what you would think about with a friend. A reliable friend is consistent. They show up when they're supposed to show up. They do what you ask or what they say that they're going to do. And reliability in terms of testing and even research more generally is consistency. And so a lot of the ways that people measure test reliability is that they often give the test multiple times and they see how well does each person score correlate across the multiple times in the university level. And then also I think for high stakes testing, another way that they measure reliability is what's called split half reliability. And they take a random half of the items and they see how well does this correlate with the other random half of the items. And the wonky part that I'll skip over that you mentioned, Stefan, is that when one does that, when speed has been a variable in the test, one gets an artificially increased or inflated assessment of reliability because you have that extra measure. You have that Stefan's going to do super well in a test that's crammed for time. Saul's not going to do so well in a test that's crammed for time. That looks like it's, dependable. It looks like it's reliable, but it's actually artificial because it's about people's ability to do well under the time pressure rather than about the test itself.
Yeah, to me, that makes a lot of sense, actually. It's just an extra element that inflates the perception of the test reliability without reference to the thing we actually care about. Saul, do you want to comment on that at all, or should we?
I just want to show comment on how much that applies to our medical students who are struggling with, say, the Step 1 exam for the National Board of Medical Examiners, the USMLE exam, because the ones who are not given accommodations, despite having a learning disability and requesting accommodations, will be forced to take the test under, quote, standard conditions, and they may not be able to pass. And they will often retake it and still not pass. And that'll just be, quote, confirmation that the test was, quote, reliable and that they, quote, don't know their stuff. When compared to other students who don't have that disability and who will pass it. And if you retested them, they would probably pass it again. And so, the people will misunderstand it and say, well, that first student clearly just they're not good enough. They don't know their stuff. But in fact, all you're showing, as Morton is saying, is that they can't show their stuff necessarily when they're not given the conditions they need to show their stuff. So it appears reliable, but it's artifactual. And in so doing, it's a grave disservice. And I think that's the point. Morton, does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think you described that perfectly.
So the next two topics potentially are related, but we'll see how it goes. The next thing you mentioned is that time-limited tests are less inclusive. What does inclusive mean here? What kind of inclusion are you concerned about?
Sure. So as Saul just mentioned, with regard to students with documented disabilities who are, by law, allowed to have extended time on time-limited tests, on most university campuses, the way that that's handled is the students actually take their tests in a different room. And often, usually, at a different time. You have segregated the students who have a legal mandate to extended time from the students who don't. And I know at my university, and I don't think we are unique in this regard at all, that even before, let's say a test is being announced for next Thursday, and the run up to next Thursday's test is all about what room the students who have the legal accommodation are going to go in, who's going to be there to proctor it, whether a student has time and a half or double time. And all of this is taking place completely separate, segregated from the rest of the students. And that's, to me, the heart and soul of lack of inclusion. And I'll just mention that one of the other things I talk about in the paper and that my research works on quite a bit is that in terms of who does have access for getting that legally mandated extended time. And we know that it's incredibly well tied to affluence. We know that one of the cocktail quizzes that I often share with my friends is, do you think there are more students at Harvard who have an extended time accommodation or more students at Poughkeepsie Community College? I just made up that name, by the way, who have an extended time accommodation. Most people would say, well, it probably is Poughkeepsie Community College, but it's just the opposite, that there are 4 to 6 times more students who have an extended time accommodation at the more elite, the more selective, the more affluent college and university than there are at the less elite, less affluent. And we see that all the way down. In my paper, I talk about students who have extended time accommodation on SAT and ACT, that they are much more likely to come from high schools that have a very low percentage of federally supported lunch programs than for high schools that don't. And the inequities in terms of who is able to get this extended time accommodation is just absolutely striking, which leads us to the fourth point that I make in my paper about equity, and that time-limited tests are less equitable for that very reason. And we know that it's not just students with learning disabilities, but also students who are learning English as an additional language, students who are from underrepresented backgrounds, students who are older than average, students from the military. We know that the veterans on university and college campuses are the least well served in terms of disability services because of the stigma involved.
Yeah, no, well, I want to touch on stigma, but I want to highlight this paradox you've just raised, which is that the idea of accommodating disability is an effort toward inclusion or assuring that all have access to opportunities in society, that they are not held back or prevented from accessing those things, whether it's entering a building or taking a test to enter medical school. And I think the paradox here is that to get that specific accommodation for high stakes tests, it turns out that having money and wealth are actually key to the equation, and that we've come up with a system to award the accommodation not just based on who needs it, but based on who has money and wealth. Is that fair to say? And it seems quite paradoxical.
Absolutely. And it is very driven by access and affluence. And it's also very driven, as you mentioned, about stigma, that there are cultures for whom identifying as a person with a disability is not a culturally acceptable thing to do. We see that with veterans. We see that with other cultures. And so it becomes this really, as you said, paradoxical phenomenon where disability accommodations should be a leveling phenomenon. It should be equating and leveling the playing field. But in many cases, it's accentuating the inequities because of stigma and also because of cost. I think most people don't realize, and Saul, it'll be interesting to find out if this was the case for you back when you were taking your boards, which is to get documentation of a disability, that's on the student and their family. And even the Government Accountability Office has reported that those numbers, this was about 5 years ago, so let's add some inflation, but that those numbers could range anywhere from $4,000 to $7,000 to get the assessment that would allow you to get the accommodation.
Yeah. I actually was just talking to our Dean of Students recently, and I think they now hope that they have enough money available to pay for students who can't pay for the testing themselves. But this has been a chronic problem. I mean, we've seen students who desperately need this type of testing so they can apply to the boards, to the National Board of Medical Examiners for accommodations. But either they don't have the money for it, or in some cases they do, but there are long delays. Often there's a huge backup in getting tested, which is a whole problem. Another problem that's related to this, because these tests take sometimes half a day or a day to do, and testing centers that do this type of cognitive testing often are backed up and few and far between. There are all of these hurdles. And I've also had situations where I talk about my learning disability openly at orientation to the incoming medical students, and I always get some emails from students afterwards. And it's almost typical now that one or two will email me and say that, they come from a particular ethnic background where their parents are just unaccepting of the fact that they might have a learning disability. Just like, no, that's not you. And so they've just shunned it, which is where the stigma, it's been an internal stigma, and they felt like something's not right. And because of that, they have avoided getting testing, they've avoided getting extra time, and as a result, they struggle. So I think all of these are factors that you've named in your paper.
When you talk about that, Saul, it does make me think about how so much debate and discussion about equity issues in medicine actually hinges on comparing the test scores of people accepted to residencies and not accepted to residencies, or accepted to medical school and not accepted to medical school. And all these discussions say, well, here's how we should look at the equity issue through the lens of that test. And what I'm hearing you say is that there could be a meaningful percentage of people, but a different percentage of people from one background than from another who are actually getting the accommodations that they might want based on wealth and support from their family. And that's going to completely distort the comparison even further, making this discussion rather untethered, actually.
Yeah, and I think what Morton is saying, which I think is so elegant, and again, she's even saying that this has been known for generations, for decades, is just get rid of this whole testing time-limited thing, because it's causing all of this headache. It's making the test less valid. And if you got rid of it and just said anyone who wants extra time can have it, then problem goes away. And I think what's so interesting to me is there's so few things that are easy to fix. We have all of these problems that are intractable. And yet this is one that seems kind of easy to fix. Culturally, it's very hard to fix because everybody is hell-bent. People are just stuck with the idea that to do away with this would be so radical, and we wouldn't know if people are good or not, and so forth. But, if you look at this logically and based on the evidence, just get rid of time testing. And then also this whole business of gatekeeping, who gets the extra accommodations, who doesn't, just goes away. So I think that's what's so compelling about this discussion, is that it's one of the few things where there's actually an answer.
So would you, Morton, would you recommend that high-stakes test organizations, potentially the National Board of Medical Examiners or other entities like that, go ahead and say, look, we are either taking off the time limits or we're doubling them if that's what you want? What would you suggest?
Well, I'm not a medical professional, so I'm out of my zone here. But for my colleagues, this is what I recommend, is that they should test without time limits. And that if their only reason to test with time limits is their assumption that the best students take the test the fastest, collect the data and you'll see that that's wrong. If their assumption is that I have to do it this way because I only have, an hour and 15 minutes or the like, then we have another discussion about it. Do you really want an hour and 15-minute sample of behavior to be directing how well this student mastered the material over an entire semester of learning?
So Morton, I'm going to push back on your disclaimer of, I'm not a medical professional, because what I think the point is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you don't need to be a medical professional to say that these time limits are not making the test more valid. So I guess I'm pushing back on you on this, because I guess what I'm saying is if we leave it with the disclaimer, I'm not a medical professional, then people could say, well, yeah, she's not a medical professional, so maybe none of this applies to medicine. But I think what you're saying as an expert, as a psychologist, and what you know about this field is you don't have to be a pilot or a medical professional to say that time testing isn't going to improve measurement of that construct. And so I guess I want to ask you, do you really think you need to be a medical professional to make this argument or not?
Well, I do tend to try to stay in my lane. Okay, so I do try, but I think you're absolutely right, which is, on the face of it, in terms of what we know about time testing, we know that time testing is less valid, less reliable, less inclusive, less equitable. We know that the correlation between people's students duration of taking a test and their performance is nil. We know that putting pressure of time testing affects a lot of students, some students more so than others. So given that information, then one could draw that conclusion. Absolutely. But as I said, I do like to stay in my lane. And
Well, yeah, but I think your lane is the lane for today's conversation. And I just wanted to quote the very last sentence of your paper here. I'm going to paraphrase. You said that perhaps the onus should fall on the teacher, not the student, to justify. In this case, the status quo is that the student has to justify that why they need extra time. And what you're saying is perhaps it should fall on the person who's developing the test to justify why there needs to be time pressure. And I think that seems to be perhaps the universal message here. And so, while I understand your caveat, you're not a healthcare professional, I think the principle would stand that if you are somebody writing the national board exam, the onus should fall on that person or that group of people to make the case as to why there should be time pressure. And if they can't make that case, and there isn't evidence for making that case, there are lots of reasons why we know it causes harm and makes their test less valid and less equitable. So there has to be a pretty high bar for them to have sufficient evidence to create what is now the status quo, which is that there's time pressure. Is that a fair statement?
That I will buy. That I definitely. And I do have that wonderful, I think, kind of cheeky statement at the end, but I think it is very, very authentic, which is that we should be justifying why we're going to put time pressure, rather than having students justify why they need to be released from the time pressure. And I just also wanted to mention two more things about the disability. One is also something I mentioned in my paper, which is there are quite a substantial body of data showing that when students do have the accommodation of extended time, they often don't use the entire amount of the extended time. And instead, what I think that the scenario is that they're saying, I just want less time pressure. I don't necessarily need 2 more hours. I just want to know that I can sit down and take this test without time pressure. And a lot of students tell us that, even those who don't have an accommodation, that they want to be able to take tests without a time pressure. And as I was mentioning a moment ago, in the disability world, there's a distinction between an accommodation and a modification legally. And an accommodation shouldn't disrupt the essential nature of the exam or the course or the work goal or whatever it is. And when we say that some students can have extended time accommodation, we're saying that time isn't an essential nature of the exam. And if time isn't an essential nature of the exam, then get rid of it.
There's a logical fallacy or a logical problem to say, we'll accommodate you by extending your time because we don't believe time matters. Oh, but by the way, if we haven't accommodated you, you're under a strict time limit because it really matters.
That is the catch-22. That is exactly the catch-22, is that if time does not disrupt the essential nature of the exam, then take away the time. And so that is a big lane that I'd be more than willing to ride in terms of this conversation.
I'm pretty excited about what you've said, and I think it will be a tough lift within the field of medicine to get people to at least reconsider how we're approaching these matters. But I want to ask Saul if you would like to have the last word on this one.
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, if anyone from the NBME is listening, I am going to go out on a limb here. And I think that given how much we all care about equity, given how much we all care about validity, given what we've learned about how the burden of proof should be on those who are designing the test, not on those who are taking the test, that time pressure matters. I think this is something the USMLE needs to really take seriously. I mean, it took so long for the Step 1 exam to go pass-fail. It just happened last year. It was such a long haul, and it made perfect sense, and we finally got there. And I think this is really the next phase, is can we get rid of this arbitrary time pressure that is causing so much trouble and contributing to inequity, cost, and so forth. And so I guess that's my plea to the folks out there who have a say in testing. And Morton, it's so helpful to have this chance to talk with you and to read your incredibly important work. So thank you for that.
Yes, and I want to say, for people who are curious about the work of Dr. Morton Ann Gernsbacher, her paper is titled 4 Empirically Based Reasons Not to Administer Time-Limited Tests. We'll include a link in the show notes, and it is publicly accessible and relatively brief. Morton, thank you so much for being on this episode with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Really enjoyed it.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have, and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Take care, everyone.